James Murphy was one of 100,000 American POWs taken by Japan when the Philippines fell in May of 1942, and he was one of the 76,000 forced into the Bataan death march, which he survived. For the first 2 years of his detention, the POW's only jobs were burying the dead when Murphy suddenly found himself shipped off with 500 other prisoners to a Mitsubishi copper mine. You swing a pick or you die. When Murphy was too weak to make the 2-mile walk to the mine, his compatriots were forced to drag him. The military was paid for every worker they provided. They didn't really care what condition you were in once you reached the mines. Then the war ends and Murphy returns home. He wants so badly to put the experience behind him that he refuses even a military debriefing describing his experience, and neither side really felt like having a frank conversation about their own war crimes at the time. Then, in 1988, apologies begin, with Ronald Reagan officially apologizing for Japanese internment and the Canadian Parliament following suit 6 weeks later. Germany apologizes for its atrocities and opens a $6 billion fund for those who were used as slave labor, with German corporations being required to pay into it, such as Volkswagen and Daimler Chrysler. When Jim hears Germany apologizing to the people that they enslaved, he says that he realized just how much he needed to hear those words. Jim and his fellow POWs begin a campaign to put pressure on Japan. In 2009, with their numbers and health dwindling, the surviving POWs decide to have one last reunion in San Antonio, for which they make one large media push for acknowledgement from Japan. One day before the reunion, a phone call. The Japanese ambassador was on his way to Texas. The ambassador stands before the POWs in a ballroom crammed with press and begins an apology that every POW feels is too broad and too vague. The ambassador appears to be apologizing for the entire war without acknowledging the specifics of what was done to them. When he finishes speaking, half the POWs give half-hearted applause, the other half stand and turn their backs. Murphy found an interesting ally in Kinue Takadome, a Japanese woman living in California who had seen the genocide denial happening in Japan and spent her own time and money interviewing Holocaust survivors across the country, translating their stories into Japanese for publication. It was through this research that she began to learn of the atrocities committed in Japan, which had conveniently been left out of her history textbooks. During a lawsuit regarding the forced labor, lawyers from Mitsubishi had argued that even admitting that they had done it was impossible, but Kinue truly believed the POWs were ready to forgive if only they could receive a sincere apology. She felt that the apology and forgiveness were the only way for Japan to move forward with a clean soul. So in 2014, she sits in front of her laptop and writes a letter to 14 Japanese companies that used forced POW labor during the war. Then, she gets a phone call from Mitsubishi. "We would like to discuss the apology issue, if you would be kind enough to visit us." In a closed room with 3 executives, Mitsubishi wanted assurances that the apology would be accepted. Japan had issued so many poorly received apologies over the years that there's an entire book written about them, and Mitsubishi wanted to make sure that they weren't about to get burned. She knows that she cannot give that type of assurance, but she tells them she knows a man who was enslaved specifically by their company, who will gladly meet with them, and she assures them that he is a very forgiving man. "I made sure they knew he hadn't instilled any bitterness in his children towards the Japanese." After reaching out to Murphy, Murphy explained exactly what the apology needed to contain. Quote, "I did it. I'm sorry I did it. I will not do it again." End quote. Everything that they hadn't heard from the ambassador. By now, Murphy's motivation for the apology had changed. Being in his 90s, he no longer sought closure, but as the last survivor, he felt he was the only person who could give Mitsubishi the absolution they required to move forward, but he was not going to agree to an apology sight unseen. When Murphy arrives at the ceremony, rather than being escorted to the main hall, he's brought to a small room where he recognizes another POW and family members of others, plus Mitsubishi executives and absolutely no press. A Mitsubishi senior executive stands and, through a translator, admits to everything that was done to the POWs. Then, quote, "When I understand the sad truth of the matter, I feel a pained sense of ethical responsibility as a fellow human being. As a representative of Mitsubishi Materials, I apologize to you deeply." End quote. What happened next, I'm told, is considered to be the deepest expression of personal shame in Japanese culture. All of the executives stood, bowed to an angle of 45 degrees, and held the bow for 14 silent seconds. Murphy said it was so sincere it nearly embarrassed him, but it was the first one he'd received that he'd ever truly believed. Then the ceremony begins. Murphy sets aside any prepared remarks that he had, stating publicly that it was his high honor to accept the Japanese delegation's apology. Everyone involved hoped that this would be used as a model and lead to a cascade of similar apologies from other Japanese corporations, but it never happened. Mitsubishi is the only company that ever genuinely tried to make things right.